Today we're talking about world building for historical fiction. It's going to be a little bit different than world building for, say, a fantasy, where you can just make up your own map. In historical fiction, we have a few more guidelines by which we need to abide to be able to create the perfect historical world that will make your readers feel like they are actually there in history. There was this old movie, I think it was like the late 70s, early 80s, called Somewhere in Time, starring Christopher Reeves. And in this story, Christopher Reeves' character falls in love with a photograph he sees of a beautiful woman from the turn of the century. He becomes so fixated on this picture that he finds a way to actually travel back in time to meet her. In order to travel back through time, he has to completely dress the part and surround himself only by things that are consistent with the time period he's trying to travel back to. He goes out and buys a legit suit from 1912 or whatever year it was, and he completely changes the setup of his room so that there is only furniture consistent with that time period. And then he stays in this room for days on end, hypnotizing himself basically, until he actually succeeds and travels back in time to the time period that he's created for himself. Over the course of the movie, of course, he does meet this girl that he's gone back to meet. They fall in love, and then at the very end of the movie, spoiler alert, they are having this tender moment together, and she's teasing him about the suit that he's wearing. He goes, "What is it with my suit? How come everyone's giving me a hard time about my suit?" And she says, "It's a little out of fashion." And he says, "What are you talking about? This suit is cool. It's got all kinds of pockets." And he's going through, "I got pockets here, I got pockets here, and then from one of the pockets, he pulls out a modern day penny. And he looks at it, and then all of a sudden, the camera goes whoosh, and he is sucked back through time, and she's calling out his name and holding out her hand to him, and then boom! He finds himself in the present day. And it is such a bummer. The point is that one item that he left from the modern day in his coat pocket ended up pulling him back to the present, ruining the whole thing. And sometimes it can happen this way if you're writing historical fiction. All it takes is one little mistake, one little thing that sounds way too modern to pull your readers back to the present. We don't want that to happen. We want our readers to feel like they are fully immersed in the time period that we are creating for them through our historical fiction. So today I've got 5 things you can do to improve your world building for historical fiction. The number one thing is to do your research. When I started the first draft for my current work in progress, which is a Western historical fiction, I was completely writing by the seat of my pants, and I was about 15 years old. I was writing a lot of historical fiction at the time, but I had never attempted a Western, and it felt very out of my comfort zone. I had never read a Western even. I'd seen a few old like Clint Eastwood Westerns, and that was the extent of my Western knowledge. And so with that limited knowledge of what the Old West was like, I just sat down and made it up. Now that I'm actually writing my first revision for that story to try to prepare it for publication, I knew the first thing I needed to do was I needed to get my history on point. I needed a small town that would feel like it was out in the middle of nowhere. I knew the year that I wanted it to be in was going to be 1888. And then I looked up different towns in the Texas region until I found one that was perfect for me. Fort Stockton fit everything I was looking for in the town. From there, I did everything I could to learn about Fort Stockton, Texas. How did it come into being? What was it like in the year 1888? You can find a little bit of information online, but it's a small enough town that even the information about it online is limited. To me, this was a challenge, but it was also exciting because that made it even more what I was looking for. Something that seemed so out of the way, so insignificant and small that hardly anyone would have heard of it unless they were from that area or close by. Why is it so important to do this research for your book? Well, let's think about this for a second. If in your book you say there's a river crossing or whatever, and then someone from that area who's a native reads that and says, interesting that there's a river here because actually that's the location of our public library, which was built in the year that this book takes place. That's a little awkward. That is the penny that is going to pull your reader back to the present and make them not be able to really feel fully immersed in the book. We do not want this to happen. And so all you have to do is do a little bit of research. Now, if you're doing a historical fiction that is set in, say, ancient Greece or ancient Egypt, it's not going to be possible, obviously, to get this much information. And in that case, it can be good for you because you have a little bit more creative freedom to build a world as long as you know major landmarks, such as the location of the Nile, the borders of civilization at the time, things like that. But especially for times that are a little bit closer to home, such as the turn of the century or the American Civil War, World War II, it is so much easier to get actual photographs and maps from the time period that you really have no excuse to not do your research and get a good idea of the layout. Number 2. Use Google Maps. Google Maps will become your best friend. Even if you're doing some ancient historical fiction set in Mesopotamia or something like that, you can use Google Maps to go and look at that landscape. Are there mountain ranges? Does it snow at any time of the year? Is it summer all year round? These are things that Google Maps will be very helpful in helping you to ascertain. I did a lot of research about different cattle drives that were passing through Texas during the time period of my book. And then I was able to use Google Maps to actually follow these trails, which has been amazing. I have been able to actually travel along the Pecos River without having to go there physically. Did I go there physically? Okay, yes I did. I have to admit, I have a very close friend who lives in Texas about 4 hours away from Fort Stockton. And so we decided we were going to make our own little writing retreat and go and visit this town so that I could get a better idea that would help me with my world building. I got to walk around the streets of historic Fort Stockton, and that was amazing. Not only that, look what I found. I don't know if you can tell how big these books are, but they are heavy. And these are full of the history of Pecos County, in which Fort Stockton resides. This tells about the very first people who ever settled there, and about the different cattle ranches that were located there, things like that. So yeah, I was pretty stoked to find these. And as you can see, I've marked up all the places that are applicable to the specific year about which I'm writing. When you're using Google Maps, sometimes you can even print off a map. Or if you wanted to, you could draw your very own map. When I went to visit Fort Stockton, they were selling maps of the area. So I was actually able to buy one, and I have it hanging on my wall. And you can't see it because it's too faint on camera, but I've actually marked this map up, and I've been able to actually draw out the trail that they're going to be traveling. So that way, as they're traveling the trail, I know when they're going to hit a mountain range, when they're going to have to cross a river, which has been totally invaluable to me. Helpful tip number 3 in your world building is going to be know what was going on at the time, either in that specific area your book takes place in or in the world in general. Beyond local geography, what was happening in the local government? What was happening in pop culture of the time? Who was the king? Who was the president? During that month that my main character arrives in Fort Stockton, there was actually a local election going on for a new judge. I don't have to go into detail about the election, but just having signs posted so it's obvious there is an election going on, and maybe having men on the street talking about it, that is perfect world building. So if you have a specific year picked out for your book, type that in, find out what else was going on in the world during that year that would have affected the characters in your book. Speaking of books, that leads us to our helpful tip number 4, which is read books that were written during that time period that you are writing in. Now, if you're writing about ancient Rome, there were books written at that time. There were ancient philosophers who were writing at that time and who were actually teaching outside on the steps of the Parthenon or whatever. Read these things. These are the things that your characters would have been hearing about, that they would have been talking about with other people. These are the things that your characters would have been reading. Reading books that were written at the time of your book is going to help you to get a good sense of the language of the time, of things like the slang of the day. Adding some slang in your dialogue will be really fun for you. When you are reading a book that was written during that time period, if the characters go to a social event, pay attention to the customs that are mentioned, to what seems to have been the norm at the time. These things are really going to help. When it comes to books that were written a long time ago, I've found that LibriVox is a really helpful resource. If you don't have time to go and read all these books because, hello, you're writing a book of your own, you can listen to the audiobook versions. LibriVox is full of books that are in the public domain. Some of them are going to be a little bit better quality than others because they are all volunteer readers, but I have been able to listen to so many old classics just while I'm sitting at my desk at work without having to take a lot of time out of my day to do so, or to go and look for them or have to spend money on them. That's a resource that might be really helpful for you, and I will link it down below so that you can use that if you need to. And helpful tip number 5 is to keep it subtle. So after you've done all this research and after you know more than you ever wanted to know maybe about this time period, write it all in there, whatever you need to. Keep notes of it so that you are aware of these things. But then when you go through and revise your book, you're gonna need to cut a lot of that stuff out because sometimes it's just too much information and more information than the reader actually needs. You want to leave in just a subtle enough amount that it's going to make the reader feel like they are there without making them feel like they're reading a textbook or an 8th grade history assignment. For instance, I have this book which has been super helpful for me called The Old Time Cowhand. This was actually written by a cowboy who wrote what it's like to be one of them. And it goes into such minute details as the different kinds of bridles that they would use on their horses, the different kinds of boots, how the boots had to fit, more than my readers are ever going to need to know about the cowboys. But I sure want to know these things because it's going to help me a lot in the descriptions I write. And also when my cowboys talk to each other, it's been really helpful in getting the dialogue just right. Do I need to share every little detail I've learned from this book? No, it's kind of a long book and no one else wants to read that. If they want to, they can read this book for themselves. Again, keep it subtle. During your first draft of the book, don't be too concerned with putting in more information than you need because it's going to be easier to cut back on information than to try to add it in later on, which, to be honest, you can also do that. And there are some facts and some world building things that I will be adding in later on, but I want the world to feel real in my head. I want to have a really good idea of what people were like at the time, what they spoke like, what their customs were like, what the layout of the land was like before I do my first draft, because I'm having to completely rewrite my book from the first draft because I made so much up that a lot of it was just not consistent with history and it would not work. My plot has actually gotten better as I've improved my world building. What's really exciting about writing historical fictions is that sometimes history is going to help you with your plot. If you need a conflict and you can't come up with a good one on your own, most of the time history's going to help you with that. You'll find that, oh my gosh, there was a war at the time, that's why he had to leave her, you know? Things like that. So the more familiar you become with history, it's going to add a richer level to your plot and a deeper level to your characters. I hope that you find those 5 tips helpful in creating a rich world that will help your readers to feel like they've been sucked back in time. I hope you liked this video today. If you did, please go ahead and like it below, subscribe, and let your friends know if they're also writing historical fiction. I will be posting more videos every Monday. You can follow me at my blog at RayleighBradshaw.com. That will be linked below. Until next time. We'll see you later. It's a pretty cool hat, huh? This is legit 1920s hat. Whew, this is hot. Oh, hot.